an IAU webinar and an IAU and Center for International Higher Education Boston College joint webinar today on a very important topic that is on the minds of many of the international community of higher education around the world. What is the future of higher education internationalization? But what in particular are our strategies, those that we can envisage for today and those that we will be able to envisage for the period post-COVID-19? We remain in a very unstable and unsure period. Even if in some parts of the world we start to see the light and the future of the IAU, at the IAU, we can also see that many countries are still facing enormous challenges when it comes to their future and the uncertainty that is brought about by the pandemic. It is not only, as we all know, a health crisis. It is already a social, cultural one. It is also an economic one. And our future will be marked by it. It will get into the history books, as many of us have already noted. And so the higher education internationalization strategies are hit very hard. They have been over the last few months. They will be so in the future as well, as we see many countries already adopting still closed futures for the international community in terms of reopening or not reopening in September. Where will we go? So that is the important question that we will be debating today. So very pleased to organize this webinar together again with the Center for International Higher Education and to build this webinar thanks to the expertise of Hans, but certainly from our esteemed speakers today. Chika Seole from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, Vidya Hiravdekar from Symbiosis University in India, Irina from an organization, the Academic Cooperation Association, José Celso Freire from UNESP in Brazil, and Robin Helms, American Council on Education. So we tried to really open up to the words that would help us understand a little bit where we can go in the future. This webinar series is part of a longer series of webinars, the IAU series entitled The Future of Higher Education, Short, Medium, and Long Term. And this topic today is not only short term, unfortunately, but certainly also medium and long term. I'm very pleased to give the floor to Hans as the moderator of this session, and later on to Giorgio Marinoni, the Higher Education and Internationalization Manager at the IAU, who will be chairing the Q&A session. So please, to all the participants, allow us to invite you to not put your cameras on, but please do also use the chat box for questions that you would like us to raise at the very end. The participants in this roundtable will be able to read them and to weave them into their conversation, but we will certainly also pick them up at the very end of this session. So the floor is yours, Hans, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Hilke, and thank you to all for joining this webinar, in particular our 5 presenters. It's a great pleasure for the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College to organize this 4th webinar together with the Internationalization of Universities on different topics of internationalization of higher education. And now we're looking at strategies for the future, which probably for many is still a little bit speculative to see what will be happening, but have that discussion now and not to be reactive to what is happening to us in the future. As has been said by Hilke, we have 5 presenters in this webinar. We will not do it by long presentations. At a certain moment, I guess everybody is getting tired of long presentations by the webinars, but we want to do it a little bit more in an interactive way. So we have scheduled 5 topics that will be addressed. First, I will ask each of the presenters to briefly introduce themselves and say what is in your country currently and for the next 5 months the key points in internationalization of higher education in your institutions. And we asked them not to focus only on COVID-19, because everybody always also gets a little bit tired about COVID-19. And there are many other important aspects at the same time that impact on internationalization of higher education. So we also want to look at what are nationalist populist trends in countries around the world that impact on institutions of higher education. Of course, the very important debate about Black Lives Matter and how that impacts also the discussions on internationalization of higher education. The economic and social and political crisis around the world, the SDGs. So we have don't focus only on COVID-19, but look in a broader way at what is the current situation and the future situation. After this first introductory round, where they will be very short in their responses, we will focus on 4 of the pillars of the American Council of Education Comprehensive Internationalization policy. So we will focus first on institutional commitments to internationalization, then on student mobility, then on internationalization of the curriculum, and last, if we have enough time, on partnerships and collaboration as the 4th of the 6 pillars. And then we will have a Q&A session. And so please don't hesitate to put questions, as Hilge said, into the chat box for the panelists, and Giorgio Marinoni will be facilitating that part of the process. So let me start with first asking Robin Helms to briefly introduce herself and what are the key points in the American context, because we wanted to have a global perspective. So that's why we have American, European, Asian, Latin American, and African perspectives in our panel. So Robin goes first, and then Celso from Brazil goes, and then Dr. Vidya from India, then Chika Shola from South Africa, and then Irena Fearinks from Europe. So Robin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Hans. Very excited to be here today. I'm Robin Matras-Helms, Deputy Chief Innovation Officer and Principal Internationalization Strategist at the American Council on Education. I will speak mostly about the US perspective today, but I did have a chance to connect with my colleague Adel El-Zaim, who's Chief International Officer at the University of Ottawa, about the Canadian context as well. So I'll weave in a bit of a regional perspective as I'm able to. So 3 topics that I think are really top of mind for what institutions are facing in the US in terms of internationalization in the next few months. The first is international students and scholars. We're thinking about still how are we supporting the students who are on campus right now and have been there over the summer. We are very concerned about visa policies for students returning. There's an overall tightening of visas, as I'm sure many have read about. This applies to the H-1B visa, which can impact the hiring of faculty from other countries. It does not apply to student visas or to visiting scholars. So that is a bit of a reprieve. But again, the overall message of visa tightening is certainly of concern at this point. And institutions really are preparing for a worst case scenario, the potential of having no international students on campus and all of the programmatic and budgetary implications of that. And that's also compounded by the fact that, as in many places, I think campuses are still figuring out the fall and what campus is going to look like for everybody and if students will be back. Institutions are thinking about online options for international students and figuring out the international tax implications of that. And there's a lot of nuances, again, as each situation is sort of dealt with, it's figuring out the next issue for the international student and scholar population. And this is a priority concern for Canada as well. The second concern I'll mention, and this came up in the introductions, was major budget shortfalls. This is related to the international student piece and tuition that those students would be bringing, but is also funding more broadly. So state funding for higher education also is potentially decreased a lot. So institutions are figuring that out. And in some cases, having to reconfigure their offices and the roles of their staff around internationalization. And then the last piece I'll mention is the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece. we are thinking a lot in this country for a lot of reasons about how to bring together more intentionally internationalization with diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Something that's long overdue, and we've chipped away at a little bit, but national events have really brought that to the fore. And so I think we're really thinking about equity in all of our internationalization activities. And this is also front and center in Canada right now as well.
Thank you very much for this pointed things. As an H-1B visa holder myself, although that doesn't forbid me to go to the United States, but I'm stuck still in Europe because of the travel arrangements that have been made. But anyway, that's a very serious concern that everybody has. So, Celso, can I give you the floor to talk from a Brazilian, Latin American perspective on this issue?
Okay. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I would like to thank Hans, Hugh, and Giorgio for inviting me. My name is José Celso Freire Jr. I'm an electrical engineer with a PhD in computer science. Since 2009, I'm working as the Associate Provost for International Affairs at São Paulo State University in Brazil, in the state of São Paulo, sure. And besides, I also acted as president of the Brazilian Association for International Education from 2011 to 2018. To facilitate your understanding today, I must give you a general overview of the prevailing situation in Brazil during this COVID-19 outbreak. As you probably know, maybe we have in Brazil one of the worst leaders in crisis management in the world. The president is conducting the country in a crusade against the confirmed good practices to deal with the pandemic. Besides, several governmental actions and policies are against most of the principles that we defend in international education. We'll talk a little bit about some of them today. The situation is so inappropriate that the numbers I will give you are not the ones produced by our Minister of Health that decided to use a criterion not accepted by the scientific community. So what happened? The leading communication media in the country build a consortium and collect the information every day. Today, we count with almost 1.4 million people infected and more than 58,000 deaths. And the situation shows no sign of improvement in the future. The economic situation as around the world is dramatic. The Brazilian GDP was forecasted to decrease by 6.5% during 2020. If before the pandemic, the country was already experiencing high unemployment of 11.2%, projections indicate that currently this number should reach 17% by the end of 2020. As the federal and state governments fully fund public universities, they are facing a complicated scenario to maintain their high-quality activities. The private sector is also facing huge problems, as a lot of students stopped to pay tuitions. Default in April was 72% higher than April 2019, and evasion increased by 32.5% in the same period. The far-right government agenda is also influencing different aspects of Brazilian life. For example, in opposition to what is happening in the world, the Brazilian CO2 emissions during the pandemic increased due to the fires occurring in the Amazon rainforest. However, in the context of our conversation, perhaps the most challenging situation to mention is the attack against the autonomy of universities from the Minister of Education. It's a battle. Minister of Education and higher education institutions. And also critical cuts on federal funds to support research activities, projects, and scholarships. I stop here.
Thank you. Unfortunately, several countries have to compete who is the worst leader in management these days. Good example still left somewhere. New Zealand is an example of that, maybe. But thank you for giving this overview. Yourself and the key points in the current situation in India. Can somebody unmute? Yeah.
So thank you very much, Professor Hans, for inviting me again. I think we've been on too many webinars now, so people may be fed up with our faces. But nevertheless, I hope the audience is new here. So the situation in India, and I wouldn't want to comment about the COVID and the management of COVID situation in India, because here we are to discuss internationalization and I think the positive aspects of internationalization in the next 5 months. And I'm an optimist myself, so I believe that now is the time for internationalization, and specifically internationalization at home. And if you look at what's happening in India, we've always been a sender country to the UK, to Europe, and to the US. So a large number of Indian students would go out of India for higher education to these places. And now they're going to be held back. So Indian universities will have to accommodate these students. So suddenly when, the numbers are going to grow in the Indian universities, so that's a positive change. The only thing is whether Indian universities can really meet up with the expectations and aspirations of these students who would probably want to study in some of the best American universities or the best European universities. However, the Indian government has come up with the National Institutional Ranking Framework, and just recently, last week, it was launched for this year. And I'm sure the top 50 universities in India, which are ranked amongst the top 50, are the best ones where these students can find their place. The second is that the foreign students that would come to India for higher education, especially from the Afro-Asian countries, now the numbers are going to decrease. So Indian universities never looked at the so-called commercial angle of bringing in foreign students, but certainly the more socio-cultural angle and the angle of diversity, where we wanted foreign students to sit in our class besides our Indian students. That's not really going to happen, because all of us know that international travel is going to be curbed and international mobility of students is certainly going to be curbed. So all the universities are gearing up for online education, which has come like a bolt. I mean, no one was prepared for it. When the crisis happened in the month of March, our academic years were just about to end, and somehow the teachers gathered and put in online classes, online evaluation assessments, and managed to complete that year. But now we have we had about 2 months of vacation in April and May, and anyways there was a lockdown. So we don't know when it will open, but we are hoping that by September our university is open. And in these 3 months, the faculty are really building capacity and trying to create, good online courses that can be given to the students, even if the lockdown, is postponed to maybe October or November. So that's the change that we're going to see in the next 5 months, which is a huge amount of student influx that would have otherwise gone abroad. The second is building capacity of our own faculty for online education, being prepared for the whole semester. This is the first 6 months of online education to be imparted to students. For the private universities, yes, finance may be a problem because there's a kind of localization that's happening within India, where students were pretty mobile within India, like they are mobile in Europe. So our states are like European countries. So we had a lot of mobility internally. That's really going to be curbed because there are some hotspots of COVID, like the city that I come from, which is Pune, very close to Mumbai. In Maharashtra, both the cities are very heavily affected, and therefore this was always called as a student city. It was called Boston or Oxford. But now I don't know what's going to happen, I mean, apart from international students, even national students that would otherwise come to study here would definitely be decreased. So we are going to see this change. On the research front, faculty have started getting a lot of time. And they've really connected well with the international counterparts through webinars, through online discussions. And we see a large number of research proposals and research publications happening jointly between Indian and foreign faculty members. That's really a good sign, because the period of lockdown was really kind of used by the faculty members very meaningfully. One, of course, creating online courses, building their own capacity, and of course doing joint research with foreign faculty. So we see, I mean, I'll limit my discussion to this hands, because I know there are other questions coming up on collaboration and other things. So I think in the next 5 months, we see this change of the attitude of faculty, their capacity and capability, and the diversity of students, which is within, our own country. We don't know what's going to happen to the diversity that we would see otherwise in our classroom.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you also for addressing the opportunities that the pandemic and current developments have for internationalization and looking at it in a different and new way. And we might be coming back to that later on as well. Chika Sehole, South Africa, the floor is yours to introduce briefly yourself and also address some of the key points from South African perspective, because I know you have a broader African role as well with Annie, etc.
Thank you very much, Hans, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this webinar. My name is Chika Sehole, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Pretoria. And I'm the current board member of the African Network for Internationalization of Education, and also the former chairperson of that particular outfit. I'm going to speak about key developments. I know, Hans, you said we must not focus on COVID, but for my introduction, I'll focus on COVID and contextualize it in terms of how it affects education and internationalization of education. The first key point which I want to raise is, which I think is relevant for the next 4 or 5 months, is the opening of higher education institutions and the return of international students back to their institutions and into the country. And this is important because COVID hit us and we had a national lockdown about 6 or 7 weeks after the start of the academic year in South Africa. So those students who left the country to beat the national lockdown before the closure of national borders are now in their own countries, and national borders have not yet opened. And so I see the return of international students back to the campus to continue with their academic year where there is a need, being the major factor that will be a focus over the next few months. And depending on how COVID recedes and national borders are opened and students are allowed to return to campus, we may see the return of students from their home countries to different campuses, or we may see the continuation of online provision of education, which has been ramped up over the past few months to allow the continuation of the academic year. Currently, our university is offering tuition to students from over 40 countries around the world. And the second thing which I think is important is to reflect on is the financial impact of COVID on institutional budgets and family budgets. The unbudgeted costs of COVID still have to be realized. This includes the costs related to online teaching, purchasing of computers, where government had to come into the fray to purchase computers, data, amongst others, for students, and the cost related to the mandatory testing of students and staff and the purchase of PPEs. And the next point related to that is the decline in third stream income due inter alia to the dramatic declines in financial markets and the plummeting economies. And there might be a reprioritization that might take place in terms of institutions giving more attention to those activities that might have been affected by COVID. And this might affect, resources that were made available for internationalization and funding of international students in the form of scholarships and bursaries. Lastly, related point on finances is also the financial hardships for many families that is resulting from the loss of jobs and the businesses closing, which may result in high indebtedness of students, which may affect their studies. Lastly, in terms of possibilities and opportunities presented by COVID, is the continued online offerings which tested the ability and the capacity of institutions to reach their students globally. This may make institutions to actually think about the nature of campus-based offerings and off-campus offerings, which may be of benefit to international students. Thank you.
Thank you very much to giving this background from South Africa with all the challenges that you already had with an economic crisis in South Africa, and then the pandemic coming back to that and impacting higher education, families, and by that also international students from the SADC countries in particular that are related to South African higher education, which has always been a very solidarity point of perspective there. Last but not least, Irina Ferenc, can you say something from the European perspective? Yeah, somebody can unmute Irina.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much, colleagues at IIU, for the invitation. Well, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to all of you, depending on where you're watching us from. I'm Irina Ferenc, working as a Deputy Director for the Academic Cooperation Association, or ACA in short, which is based in Brussels, Belgium, and which is both a think tank in international higher education as well as a membership organization, bringing together national level agencies and organizations that support the internationalization of higher education systems, and that importantly provide different types of funding for internationalization activities. So today in the panel, I'll try to comment on from these multiple perspectives of policies, of programs development, of research in international higher education, without aiming to be exhaustive in any way about European level developments. Europe, as you know, is quite a diverse continent, but I'll try to focus in my points on some commonalities and red threads we see across the board. Now, getting to your question, Hans, and trying not to repeat what was said already by colleagues covering the other regions, although there are many similarities, I'd like to make three system-level observations on the current and immediate future realities, and they have to deal with flexibility in activities, with changing narratives, and also with a concern for funding and money-related considerations. I think a first noteworthy development in Europe in recent months, as in other parts of the world, has been the level of immense efforts and at the same time great flexibility put in place by higher education institutions, by funding organizations, both at national and European level, and by other actors, in making sure that international engagement in higher education is continued as much as possible, despite these unusual circumstances. And this flexibility, I dare say, in the European context has gone well beyond what we previously thought was actually possible in terms of the way we carry the typical internationalization activities and the way they are moved forward. And I think this is important because given the remaining uncertainties, this flexibility we know very well already now will have to be continued well into the coming months and probably well into the coming year, which is both a challenge, I think, for the different actors concerned, but at the same time a great opportunity for facilitating some further innovation on some of our traditional models and forms of engagement. Now, the second observation, as I mentioned, relates to changing narratives on some of the key topics and objectives we've set for ourselves as a sector. And I'll use one example, that of widening inclusion in internationalization activities to showcase what I mean. Well, the objective of widening inclusion in internationalization has been an objective that was assumed, I think, both at policy level in Europe and at different higher education institutions before the current pandemic and before the surge in nationalistic tendencies that we see in some countries. But I think what the past months have very clearly shown us is also the limitations in our previous conceptualization and conversations about the topic. And we've been revealing in the past months new layers and aspects of underrepresentation that we need to address. New things have been brought more to the forefront, I would say, from issues of discrimination based on nationality. I think we've all seen the news related to discrimination of, for example, Chinese or Italian students at the beginning of the pandemic on European campuses. Discrimination based on race, and also issues related to equity in access to online education, which I think are emerging topics that will, in the coming months, come even more at the forefront of our conversation about inclusion in a European context. And the third observation, and I think that relates very much to what the colleagues have highlighted in their interventions previously as well, an ongoing concern about public funding in higher education more broadly, and also for internationalization of higher education activities. At a policy and program level, this year is an important one in the framework of the European programs, because the next generation of programs for education and training is being launched, and budgetary negotiations are still to be finalized. So everybody is watching with great excitement and concern, to a certain extent, how, for example, the budget of the Erasmus program might be affected by other competing priorities at the moment, also given the ensuing economic recession. And I think what we can expect from there, beyond the European level programs, when it comes to national level action, is not a unitary response. What we've seen also from the financial crisis, I think, of 2008, the way different countries within Europe have responded differed greatly. Some really invested or prioritized investment in education and in international higher education as one of the key motors to get out of the economic downturn, while others, where we see governments with more nationalistic tendencies in place, have used this as an opportunity and an excuse to reduce funding in these areas. So overall, I think, yeah, there's great diversity still to come in responses, also when it comes to the funding aspects. And I think for now I'll leave it there, because I know we will be going deeper into some of the subtopics later.
Great, thank you, Irina. Not only Associate Director of ACA, but as of September also the full Director of Academic Cooperation Association. Welcome in that position already. We have been looking at some of the key issues that affect higher education and internationalization, tied to all the reasons like COVID-19 in particular, but also other issues like nationalism, populism, financial crisis, etc. So that is clear all over the place, although there are different accents if you look to Europe than compared to North America, and even between Asia and Africa and Latin America. And we might come back to that, but one of the striking points, in particular in the presentations of Dr. Vidya and Dr. Chika, was that it impacts also the mobility side, and that maybe there will be increased much more on local students not going abroad, but having to then be absorbed by the local institutions and all the challenges in quality and funding that relates. But that might come back later. What I wanted to discuss now is, what does that mean in the sense, what can we expect from institutional leaders? We have seen over the past decades an increased interest and motivation at the leadership level in our institutions of higher education in favor of internationalization of higher education. If you look at the surveys that the International Association of Universities has done, you see that around 65 to 70% of institutional leaders say, well, we have an internationalization strategy, and also internationalization is a key aspect of our overall strategy. And there has been all kind of support to stimulate internationalization in the institutions. What do you foresee that the current aspect that you have been mentioning, increasing focus on concerns in finance, increasing online, etc. What will be the response from institutional leaders to internationalization? And Irina, if I can give you the floor first to say, well, what do you see in the European context that will this positive attitude towards internationalization increase, or will you see maybe in different parts of Europe different responses to that development? You have to, can somebody mute? Yeah.
Is that
Yes.
me?
Thank you very much.
Irina first, and then we go to Dr. Vidya, and then to Shika. Yeah, Irina.
Yes, thank you, Hans, for the question. And I think indeed how we see leaders respond when it comes to commitment to international education will depend very much on whether we mean leaders within international higher education or within higher education institutions, or politicians. And I think the way the response will come might differ depending on this role that different leaders have, and depending on different countries we refer to. But indeed, I think if we talk about leaders within higher education, so at institutional level, I think in Europe, indeed, the commitment to internationalization was already quite high. At the same time, the past few months, because of the political and health-related measures that were put in place by individual European countries, for example, we have seen exposed some system-level weaknesses that international higher education has by default tried to counteract, and might need to do that even more so in the future. So if I'm to reflect on European level developments, we've seen, for example, some of the limits of European solidarity and coordination that I think to an extent we had previously taken for granted. We have seen the reinstatement of national borders to a certain extent, and controls, and the granting of access based on nationality, which is a painful déjà vu, I dare say, for many of us, and also a resurgence of nationalism in not a small number of European countries. At the same time, I think what the past few months have shown us, at least in our bubble of international higher education practitioners, scholars, and leaders, is that we need even greater commitment, and that we need to work harder also at the policy level, and be louder as a field on the value and importance of international higher education. Now, if I am to really approach the question also not only as a leadership level or dimension, but also in a more pragmatic way in which commitment has been impacted, I would say that relates also to, we've seen a change in the way institutions relate and prioritize perhaps different internationalization activities over others. And in Europe, I think we're finally moving past some of the previous almost ideological divides, if you wish, between internationalization abroad activities, primarily exemplified by mobility of students and staff, and internationalization at home developments, where I would include also now virtual collaboration, online international exchanges, and so on. And we're finally, I think, coming to a point where we can acknowledge that, well, first of all, this contradiction is an artificial one. That it's not necessarily in intercultural competences and skills. I think I'll leave it maybe there for now, to also give the others a bit of chance to respond, and coming back later.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Vidya, can I give you the floor from Indian institutional perspective? Can somebody unmute Dr. Vidya? Yeah.
Yeah. So good question, Hans. I think we need to look at how internationalization and what has been the journey of internationalization in our country, in India, and if you look at it in the larger context of Asia and Asian countries. So, we all know that the history of Indian higher education is such that, centuries ago, internationalization was there in India, in the sense there were foreign students and foreign scholars that came and studied in Indian universities of the past. But, a little bit pre-independence and post-independence, there was a lull. No one spoke about this word called internationalization of higher education at all in India. But over the last few decades, we've been seeing an upsurge where Indian leaders and Indian policymakers, and more importantly, leadership of Indian universities is trying to bring in internationalization as a strategy or in their vision or mission statements. there could be different reasons why university leaders want to do this. It could be just to benchmark the university against other universities within India or globally. B, it could be the commercial angle where they still believe that foreign students would get a better tuition fees and better finances. And three, and most importantly, I for one believe, for which our university, which was practically born for international students, the Symbiosis International University that I represent, since 50 years, we've been having a large number of foreign students from almost 85 countries, not with the objective of actually looking at the commercial angle or anything else, but simply with a strong belief that the global solidarity, or what we call as the world is one family, is ingrained in every stakeholder, every student that studies at our university. So I think the larger importance of internationalization is what is now believed by university leaders, that there is a lot of diversity and diverse discussions that happen in classrooms. And I think in this era of nationalism in most countries that you see, America for Americans, and so on and so forth, I think it's very important to have students from different countries studying together and mixing up and being friends at such a young age, so that they carry this feeling of being sensitive to each other's cultures, religions, regions, etc. And I think this interculturalism is what is the larger meaning of internationalization, which now university leaders have started to believe. And therefore, even if you look at the top Indian universities, the top 50 Indian universities, you will see a spillover of international students, international faculty, collaboration and partnerships between foreign and Indian universities, because they really feel that internationalization is something that is important now. As regards policymakers, we've seen in the last about 4 to 5 years, again, a change. Since the last 3 years, since 2018, a formal program was launched, which was called the Study in India program, and to attract foreign students to India and to Indian universities. Another program was launched called the Global Initiative of Academic Network, which was again for the faculty members, foreign faculty, to come and teach in Indian universities. So this mobility aspect was taken care of. Now we are talking about how can we internationalize our campuses, how can we internationalize our curriculum. And recently we've formed a network which is called the Indian Network for International Education at the Association of Indian Universities level. And that's going to actually really be a game changer, because Indian universities are now going to come together for the first time, form this network like the African Network for International Education and several other networks that are prevalent, and really going to discuss internationalization and deliberate and kind of probably spill over this whole, it's like a bug that will catch all the other Indian universities. So certainly we're going to see a change. Internationalization has now been also linked to rankings and quality, which never happened in India. If you look at the rankings, which are international rankings, the QS and the Times Higher, they did include a little bit of internationalization, more to do with mobility, inbound, outbound students and faculty. But even in our national institutional ranking framework, we find a little space, not as much as what we would expect, but a little space on internationalization there. In the National Assessment and Accreditation Council, and when universities go in for accreditation, they do include again a little bit of internationalization in their calculations when they come in for for accrediting our campuses, which means at the policy level, at a leadership level of the country, I was surprised to even hear in the finance minister's speech, some of my Indian friends are here today, that she spoke about internationalization and earmarking certain funds, to attract foreign students to India and, do a lot of things. So which means that at a policy level, at the government level, they are talking about internationalization. And of course, at the university level, leadership also is talking about internationalization. So all of us who are in this space really feel happy that it's like catching like wildfire in our country.
Thank you. And good to hear that there's optimism from the Indian side on institutional commitment to that. Chika, may I ask you brief and try also, I'm a little bit worried about time, to be focused and short all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. In the crisis we are facing, we have seen a commitment of institutional leaders to support international students. And there's also been, support from government in terms of the directives and the policies which have been developed, which were not excluding international students in terms of what should happen to them. And all of these things have been driven mainly by issues of safety and security, especially around COVID. The closure of national borders and the mandatory quarantine of students for 14 days, and whoever comes from outside the country are some of the directives which government has imposed on higher education institutions, and that is mainly driven by the quest for safety and security. The next thing which I want to talk about is the fact that I see commitment to internationalization continuing on the African continent. Internationalization has been central to the mission and strategic goals of many and major African universities. I see many of these institutions committing resources to reposition themselves as institutions of choice for mobile students, and also international institutions that are seeking partners in finding solutions to post-COVID-19 challenges and problems. And this, there are opportunities for international collaborations, especially in research, such as, that focuses on infectious diseases that have, I believe, become very prominent in the light of what we are going through. I think collaboration around research on human health and well-being is going to be, of importance. So there is room, in my view, for international collaboration also in terms of how we teach and how we should teach and how we should assess our students in the light of current developments. And I see institutions, focusing their resources and their priorities to those issues, which should be of benefit to both international students, researchers, and scholars.
Thank you. Also, a good appeal to focus on not only the educational side, but also on the research collaboration, the role that institutions can play in that. Celso, can I ask you to address the issue? Unmute. Yeah.
So nowadays, whether among the largest and most prestigious Brazilian higher education institutions, where internationalization has already established itself as a tool of seeking excellence, I believe it's important. Internationalization in the biggest university in Brazil is a way to seek excellence, or even among the smallest ones that are beginning the journey. Internationalization is not a very old process in Brazil. It really started for most of the institutions with the Science Without Borders about 10 years ago. The commitment to the internationalization process is established. Everything, however, will depend on the financing available, and this is critical. Internationalization in Brazil is something that is state funded. If we don't have money, I don't know how we will move forward. We have two groups of universities in Brazil. We have the universities that are fully funded by the new CAPES project, named PRINT. Then for 36 institutions, we already have money to develop internationalization actions, most of them concentrated in research, in exchange of PhD students. But we'll talk a little bit more about mobility after. But for the other group of institutions, I really don't know how they will arrive to develop internationalization actions. Besides, there is another problem. We have a group of people that will say that we need to internationalize when we will have more resources for that. That we need to wait to see if we will have resources, and as you probably know, we will never have this amount of research. Then it's a critical situation. In my point of view, the leadership of institutions, they must demonstrate an active commitment to internationalization actions. But to have this happening, we need in some way establish and prove that internationalization could be essential for the day today of universities. Though, I believe that the future, the institutional future for the internationalization will be influenced in part by the type of collaborations that partner institutions are willing to develop in Brazil. I don't know if we'll have more time to talk about collaboration, but I believe the future will rely a lot on the type of collaborations that will be established by the Brazilian institutions and by the partners in other countries of the world. This is my point of view.
Thank you. And Robin, can you say something about how is institutional commitment in the United States and maybe also Canada in this complicated times, in particular in the US these days?
Absolutely. So I think we're seeing an interesting polarization in terms of commitment at this point. Looking, for example, at the institutions that are part of ACE's Internationalization Laboratory Program, these are institutions that are undergoing a strategic planning process for internationalization that started before any of what's going on now happened. So they made this commitment. And what we're seeing, I think, at those institutions now as this is playing out, is that everyone is recognizing the need for global engagement for all the reasons all the other panelists have talked about. But again, we're seeing those very harsh budget realities. And in some institutions, one of those is outweighing the other. So in some cases, budget cuts, again, mean staff reductions and a decreasing commitment to internationalization. But interestingly, in others, we're seeing the opposite happen, and institutions really sort of doubling down on their commitment, again, recognizing how important this work is. And because COVID-19 in particular started as an international education issue and then quickly grew to encompass the rest of the universities, also, we're seeing senior international officers, for example, being elevated to cabinet positions because they've been leaders in this on their campuses. So we're seeing in some cases an elevation of internationalization. And I will say we have a very robust cohort coming up for the next round of our internationalization laboratory. So that's a signal that institutions are still committing to this as well. And then I'll just make one point on kind of the policy piece as well. So obviously we have an election coming up. It's very hard to predict where the politics will go at this point in terms of the nationalism and the other things. It's certainly been an interesting ride for the last 4 years. But one distinction in the US is that whereas the IAU survey data and what we're hearing from our panelists indicate that government policy is a major driver of internationalization and a driver of institutional commitment to internationalization, that's much less so in the US to begin with. Really, the onus is on institutions themselves to make the decisions about where their commitment is. So in some ways, the politics and those what's coming out in the US on that front are less dramatic and less influential than in other places. That is different in Canada, though, I will say, and my colleague there had mentioned that the government is considering its internationalization strategy now and reconsidering that, and particularly thinking about how to become the leading destination in North America for international students. So a bit of a different take on the policy piece between the two countries.
Okay, thank you. And it's good to point it out, that the difference of more autonomy in institutional strategy and maybe even to a certain extent an advantage of a lack of government commitment, which can float from one way to the other and so it's less stable. It's good to make that point. Thank you all for addressing that. We're going to the next point, which is student mobility. And of course, that has been at the forefront in the whole past months as an impact of how a pandemic as COVID-19 impacts on student mobility in all kinds of different ways, in particular on international students and on also exchange and study abroad for credits. And we see also discussions already in the chat about, for instance, what has the alternative of online education means for, is that a future prospect as an alternative or not? What does it mean with tuition fees? We have already in the first round have discussions about will students from sending countries still be able to go abroad, or will that be that they go much more to the local or to the online delivery? So let's talk about it, and let's make a decision, the distinction between the more emerging and developing countries. We have Brazil, we have South Africa and India, so we have 3 BRICS countries in our panel, and maybe start with addressing them from their perspective. So Chika, can I ask you, what does international student mobility in the South African context mean post COVID-19?
Well, thank you very much, Hans. Well, you'll be aware of the fact that at the moment, South Africa is one of the most affected countries in terms of the number of COVID infections and deaths. So much as it has been a challenge for the global north in terms of the numbers which we've been dealing with and deaths, that is now coming into the south, and it might have some, implications for students, coming to South Africa. But I still, I want to talk about it also in the context of what we saw happening, in the global north around April, May, where we had, we saw numbers of infections and deaths in the global north. When Italy, Spain, and the US, and how these countries have struggled to deal with a pandemic at the time when in the south, many countries on the continent had low levels of deaths and infections. So the myth of the global north being safe and capable of dealing with problems has been dispelled. And I think that may have some influence on the choices of students in terms of where they want to study. The second point which I want to raise, which countries in the South may benefit from, is the George Floyd incident and the global coverage it got in the media that sparked, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was another incident that signaled that all is not well and Black lives are not necessarily safe in some of the destinations that used to be very popular for people of the South in the past. Now, in the light of the above, I see the continuation of a trend among international students looking for alternative destinations, including in the South. A book of African scholars focusing on intra-Africa mobility, which I've just finished co-editing, shows the existence of affordable, quality higher education in African universities, which students found in those countries they were studying in. And I see this phenomenon continuing to grow. And that is if African governments and universities can seize this opportunity that has been created by the current global crisis we've been dealing with. And I also see the role of regional agreements, both in Southern Africa, in East Africa, that facilitates the mobility of students, especially in terms of treating international students from the region as home students in terms of the cost of education, benefiting the mobility of students in those countries. So I see possibilities of a shift in the patterns of students, international students, more towards regionalization, as it has already happened. So the increase of regionalization benefiting from the global crisis, I see it as a pattern that will continue to grow.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for addressing this whole issue of how impact Black Lives Matter has on student mobility, which I think will be indeed an increasingly more important factor in the whole internationalization debate. Dr. Vidya, can I ask you to address student mobility? You have been touching upon it already a little bit in your previous presentation, but please go ahead.
So as I said earlier, India is a sender country. So we have about 10 lakh, which is 1 million students, Indian students studying abroad in various universities, primarily, of course, the US, UK, Europe, and maybe Singapore and some parts of, of course, Australia and some parts of Asia. So these students are right now, of course, they've almost 70% of them have come back because of the scare of COVID in those countries where they were studying. Some of them are stuck up there and wanting to come back. We don't know whether they will go back or they will want to study in India, or they would take a year drop. It's still, unclear. There are a lot of studies that are going on right now to find out what these students who were studying abroad and have come back to India, what are they going to do? Whether Indian universities are going to admit them midway, because again, not great collaboration, so we don't know, we've never mapped credits like this. So whether the students are going to be losing a year or, so there is a lot of uncertainty amongst this lot of students. There are hardly 47,000 foreign students studying in more than 1,000 Indian universities and institutions. So that's again, you see there's so many students going out and hardly any coming in. Though, as I said earlier, that the government is making efforts, but then COVID happened, and now it's going to dip further. There are a lot of scholarships that are announced for students from Afghanistan, from West Asia, Africa specifically. So a lot of efforts by the Indian government, by Indian universities to attract students, to give them scholarships. But again, because of just the scare of travel and the curve of this mobility, we don't know whether this number is going to drop, or if the picture is clear, then what's going to happen, whether foreign students will still want to come to India, at least from the neighboring countries, where they may find India safer than their own countries. The third aspect is about Indian students who were supposed to go this academic year abroad. We have every year almost 200,000 students leaving India to go and study abroad, either for undergraduate programs or postgraduate programs, or a few for doctoral programs also. Now, what happens to these students? Will they want to be here, or will they want to go back? So again, a lot of studies are going on this, trying to ask students and parents what they plan to do. The economic crisis again will curb parents funding their students to go abroad. So as I said earlier, whether Indian universities are prepared to accept these students in large numbers, are Indian universities prepared to meet up with the aspirations of these students? So it's a still very uncertain period for us. I think by September the picture will be clear, September and October this year, because those who want to remain within the country will remain, and those who want to travel abroad will try and travel if the situations in those countries are good. I've seen a couple of students, especially the medical postgraduate medical students, at least the two of them from my city that I know, have managed to take flights and go to universities in the US for their postgraduate medical studies. So they are taking that risk and wanting to go, but we don't know what the larger picture is going to be. So I can only conclude by saying that yes, mobility is going to be curbed, and I think universities need to look at alternative ways of engaging with foreign students and connecting our Indian students to foreign students. So again, we come back to the topic of internationalization at home, my favorite topic. We'll discuss that later.
Okay, thank you. Celso. And we have to unmute.
Yeah. So I would like to talk about different topics. Just to start, I need to explain that degree-seeking students in or out is almost, this kind of mobility is almost inexistent in Brazil. As well, the recruitment of international students for several reasons. Language, public higher education in Brazil is free of charge, then students will not go abroad to look for education. But this is another discussion, I will not talk about that, but you need to know that degree-seeking students are almost inexistent in Brazil. Another point that I need to clarify is that in public higher education, this is connected to mobility. The presence of e-learning in regular courses is not very common. So what happened in that now with the COVID, the institutions somehow were forced to organize themselves to offer distance learning to students isolated at home. It was a huge transformation in public university in Brazil. The private ones, in 1 week, they move it to e-learning, but for the public ones, it was very complicated for different reasons, but we need to have time to discuss about that, primarily due to a massive resistance from several professors' unions. Because of the policy from the Minister of Education that was pushing institutions to change to virtual, then everything makes it, and we had in the 1 month ago a huge problem to solve. But things are now, I believe all public institutions are offering e-learning activities, e-learning courses for their students. Besides, the socioeconomic background of many students in Brazil are very different from the richer countries in the world. Many of students don't have good access to internet at home, neither access to computers. That what is happening in the classes, just to have you an idea, in classes D and E, which represents about 50% of students in public universities, 80% of people access the internet only through cell phones. To minimize this problem, some universities are distributing SIM cards with internet access and lending laptops and tablets to underprivileged students. Then it's happening now and things are starting to work. So how much we can work on providing virtual access to higher education or jointly developing international virtual exchange or mobility is not very clear. However, the perception that is an urgent action is present, even considering that online doesn't give you the full intercultural context. Regarding the physical mobility, everything is suspended for the second semester of 2020, and we don't know what will happen. We are not even talking about the first semester of 2021. Then to Brazil, we need to wait, in my opinion, up to September to see how we will deal with mobility in the first semester of the next year. The physical mobility of doctoral students should continue with the sandwich model that we use, but with a focus on the development of co-supervised PhD. Then all institutions are looking for possibilities for co-supervision of PhD students. To finish, the establishment of virtual mobility programs that I believe we will have time to talk a little bit more, where we can have a credit mobility process need to be further studied. Besides the fact that I already mentioned that a lot of problems that we have in the system, higher education in Brazil is very regulated. Then to accept or to allow Brazilian students to register in a discipline abroad, we need to have internal regulations, and it is new for Brazil, and institutions are just starting to discuss internal regulations to allow their students to register abroad or students from abroad to register in Brazil to have virtual credit of disciplines. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for these three different perspectives from emerging and BRICS countries. Which you see even there is a big diversity in approaches with, as Celso said, nearly no degree mobility incoming and outgoing in Brazil. India having a strong outgoing mobility and only recently starting incoming mobility, and South Africa having both models of incoming mobility, in particular from SADC countries, and outgoing mobility from South African students. So different approaches, different strategies, different needs, different desires. Let's go to Europe and then the United States, and we have to be short, otherwise we will not have time to talk about internationalization of the curriculum, and that would disappoint in particular Dr. Vidya, but also myself as being a key topic. Irina, and still you briefly talk about degree mobility, but also look at what are the implications, for instance, for the Erasmus program, which is, of course, our biggest credit mobility program in Europe. Mute. Yeah.
Yes, well, in Europe, very much indeed, Hans. I think outgoing credit mobility on the one hand and incoming degree mobility have been and remain the central pillars of internationalization activities. So obviously at this moment, these are also the areas of internationalization activities where there are most questions related to upcoming developments. And I think overall, we can conclude that we actually have more questions than we have answers at this very moment as to what the likely developments will be. When it comes to incoming degree mobility, I think there's generally wide acceptance that higher education institutions in Europe will experience a decrease. Whether this will be a small temporary dip or a large decrease on the longer run depends on a variety of factors, from the main source countries or countries of origins of international students for European countries, to how different countries deal with related administration, to facilitate mobility, for example, in issuing visas and residence permits for international students that are still on hold at the moment in many European countries, to also the kind of approach that European universities take when it comes to the first semester of the 2020-21 academic year. But overall, I think everybody expects indeed there will be decreases that will affect differently different countries, because there's also great variety in Europe in the extent to which different countries and universities depend on the income brought in by international students, because as you know, not everybody in Europe charges tuition fees, and there's also quite some variety in the tuition fees that are being charged. Related questions, of course, are at the moment the feasibility of charging fees or the same level of fees for education that will be at least partly provided online, from what it seems, because the most likely scenario at the moment is that the majority of higher education institutions in Europe will start the what is in Europe the autumn semester online, trying to resume to face-to-face physical activities and education the moment that becomes possible. But that remains a great question mark at the moment when that will actually be. When it comes to credit mobility, I'd also like to make a distinction, because most of the European level credit mobility is indeed funded through programs, either through the Erasmus program or through other regional and national level programs. And of course, the kind of measures that have been put in place by the funders will have a consequence, on the likely mobility scenarios and patterns. Overall, from a funder's perspective, there's been a host of measures put in place to adapt to grant schemes and to accommodate these new realities, from making their use still possible for students that might have to, for example, postpone their credit mobility experience in the autumn semester, that might have to start online but finish it face-to-face, and also complete a full education abroad but online. And there's been generally, I think, great flexibility in trying to create a facilitating framework to allow the mobilities to continue, maybe in a different way than initially foreseen. How higher education institutions respond to that differs greatly by country and by type of institution as well. So we do see institutions that try to remain optimistic and are still counting, hoping they will start the physical face-to-face education in the autumn. Others are a bit more cautious, and there are also institutions that have already announced that they will not facilitate at all student exchange programs in the autumn. And I have to emphasize that these are not necessarily institutions where we see a low commitment to internationalization. I dare say in some cases rather the opposite. These are institutions that have been extremely well engaged internationally and active in mobility programs, but they have taken this approach for a variety of reasons, sometimes because, well, exchange mobility needs reciprocity. And so it doesn't really help much, if one institution in a particular country wants to continue, exchanges in the fall, if the partner institutions are not ready, to facilitate the exchanges. So I think for those that have indeed already announced that they will not support exchanges in the fall, it has to do indeed with limitations of reciprocity, and also a wish to provide information early on to their students to allow them to look for alternatives, ways to achieve the same educational goals. And very briefly at the end, I think what we also saw through a funding agency perspective is also an evolving conversation about alternative mobility formats, which was already there before. So in the context of the preparations of the next generation of the Erasmus program, we were already discussing about blended mobility experiences and formats. The default model foreseen was a shorter term, a physical mobility experience of 2 weeks, let's say, accompanied by an online international learning experience. The latest developments, I think, have accelerated that conversation. It's hard, I think, to say at this stage how much of the mobility in the future, if we think well beyond the current pandemic, will be through other means than physical as we know them. But I think overall in Europe, there's definitely greater openness to online formats and to discussion about online formats than we had, let's say, a year ago.
Okay, thank you very much, giving also that perspective. So Robin, how is that in the United States and maybe Canada?
Yes. So the main driving issue on mobility, I would say, in the US at this point is we are not doing very well at containing the virus. It's spreading. We're seeing increased numbers now as things are opening up. So campus plans are very much in flux at this point, and we have the added layer that, again, we don't have government oversight dictating whether campuses will be online or a hybrid or in person. It's up to the institutions, and institutions are sort of one by one trying to figure that out at this point and deal with issues of supports for students, the logistics of dormitories, for example, how we can keep social distance. There just are no good answers at this point. And again, this is in the context of virus numbers going up at this point. And so we're seeing online enrollment for international students as a stopgap potentially. But again, there are layers of policies and issues to sort through on that front. For study abroad for US students, I think interest remains strong, but the timing is unclear at this point. Campus travel policies are varying a lot, but we're also dealing with the fact that, again, we have high rates of the virus right now, and so countries are considering or putting in place restrictions on Americans coming. So even if we have students who want to go, they may not be allowed to go into the receiving country. A couple of positive notes just to round things out. I think to Irina's points about flexibility, we're seeing that at a campus level as well. So what's kind of what counts as global learning? I think we're expanding that definition. So while study abroad may have been considered a high impact practice previously, it still is, but we're thinking about virtual exchanges and COIL, or collaborative online international learning, as part of that global learning equation in ways that I think we were not open to previously in terms of fulfilling general education requirements and that sort of thing. We're seeing a lot of interest, as it sounds like in other places as well, in virtual exchange and COIL. That does have implications, of course, for faculty development and doing it well. And I think one of the questions that came up in the chat about incorporating intercultural learning, making sure that those programs are well designed so that they really do bring the intercultural learning and the pieces that we want from our mobility experiences. And then finally, I'll just mention, I think Chica's points about the climate for international students and what international students are thinking about are very well taken. And I will certainly say that in the US, again, the issues of racial climate, diversity and equity and inclusion are front and center on campuses in general, and how we can weave the international student dimension into that is going to be very important going forward as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking a little bit about time, and so I still want to focus a little bit on internationalization curriculum as a last point, and then we see if we have still time for some Q&A. So be very short in your response. But what has been the case, of course, we always have over the, we as in particular people in our fields, like in the panel, but also people like Betty Lisk and Elizabeth Jones and myself, etc., that internationalization is so identified with mobility that we forget that that's only for a small elite of students that can have access to that kind of mobility. And we have to change our way of thinking and seeing internationalization, in which mobility is an important tool to make global learning for everybody, but that we should not exclude the 99% in the world, and that might be less in Europe and the United States, but still overall around 99% that has not the possibility to participate in mobility schemes. And so how we can internationalization at home, internationalization the curriculum, collaborative online learning, making much more to the forefront. And in very brief, a few sentences, but focus on, are you optimistic, and some have already expressed that, but are you optimistic that the crisis that we now encounter in all kinds of different ways creates this opportunity to make that shift, or will, as soon as possible, institutional leaders, governments, etc., push back and say, no, mobility, recruitment, competition, that will be the driving agenda for the future? So I would be interested to hear about that, but again, given time, be very short. Dr. Vidya, can I give you first the floor on that? Yeah.
So my favorite topic of internationalization at home, because that's what we practice or have to practice in India, even otherwise, with a large student base of almost 34 million students that we have. We cannot expect so many, or even half of them or 1/4 of them to travel abroad. So our mobility is limited to the elite few who can really travel, and therefore we need to practice internationalization at home, even otherwise, even if COVID had not happened. And I've been promoting and advocating this very much in India. And internationalization at home means obviously internationalizing the curriculum and several other things that you can do on your campus. I think the key to this is faculty engagement, because when you talk about mobility, the focus is always students. And when you talk about internationalization at home, the focus has to be faculty, because unless you take them on board, unless you make them, eat, breathe internationalization, and unless they understand the importance of internationalization, things are not going to move when it comes to internationalizing the curriculum or talking about internationalization at home. So faculty engagement is key, and we did that because, faculty are reluctant to really get into anything that is new. They're very happy in their comfort zones, teaching their own students what they think is right. But when, when we push them a little bit and tell them that, this is important, and now with this COVID crisis, there is no option but to, think about such things of IAH or internationalizing the curriculum, the faculty have got engaged. So we've tried out co-teaching with some of our collaborative partners, and that has worked beautifully. So imagine a class with a teacher of liberal arts from the School of Liberal Arts, and another one from the DePaul University in the US, though trying to meet up with time zones, still teaching a class full of Indian and American students virtually. So that's something that, which began, and now it has really, teachers have found it so exciting. And so has COIL. COIL is again something that we started with a few universities, and once the teachers come on board and they actually execute it, they feel happy about it and encouraged, and then want to do it more. So we are trying out all these things. We are trying to build capacity amongst faculty members also, because online teaching is not as easy as face-to-face, and engaging with students across the globe is still more difficult. And that too with a foreign partner university teacher is still more difficult. But once it happens, it's exciting and engaging. So we are implementing this, and I'm sure this will find more importance, now in the next couple of months, and probably it will become a way of life, Hans. I feel that this crisis is, and as I said again, I'm very optimistic, because this has come as a jolt, and I think it's really shaken us up, and things that we wanted to do in the past, we are compelled to do now. And I think this will become a habit for teachers. So, you will not give as much importance to mobility that you gave earlier. because you will find these things far easier than to really send your students on a semester abroad and map the credits and bring him back and then get those credits into your whatever your system is. So that was far more difficult, and this is far more easy. And I hope this becomes a way of life for us, and not just let's not limit this to just the next 5 months or 6 months.
Thank you very much for this optimistic appeal. We have to make the opportunity now. Robin, you have to be unmuted.
I would, I'll be very brief and echo largely what Dr. Vidya talked about, and just add, and yes, on the faculty piece, one of the pieces that we talk about in the US is incorporating incentives into our promotion and tenure policies. That was a question in the chat, was how do you sort of pull along the faculty who might be resistant? But the one other piece I would add to that also is very much articulating the need for student global learning in the curriculum in light of the individual mission, strategy, goals of the institution as a whole. So looking very carefully, if that mission is about serving non-traditional students, for example, or promoting student success, articulating how bringing those elements into the curriculum are advancing not only internationalization on the campus, but the overall goals of the institution, I think will be very critical, particularly in the US context, to making this take hold in the ways that Dr. Vidya talked about.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we go on to Celso. If unmuted.
Yeah, I'll talk just about one point, virtual exchange. And I'm very optimistic about what will happen in Brazil. Fulbright organized in June 4 webinars with specialists from Brazil and from abroad, and we have about 300 people participating in each of those webinars. Then we are preparing a training program to be offered to the Brazilian institutions, and we are working with DIPOL that Dr. Vidya mentioned, but also SUNY, Drexel, Tec Monterrey, all institutions that are leading this virtual exchange movement. And the idea is to transform Fulbright, the Brazilian Association for International Education, in a kind of hub, like SUNY or DIPOL, but for all Brazilian institutions. Then we will train people in Brazil, and we will create a kind of website where people could find possibilities and interests for a virtual exchange programs. Then this is the first point. Another one is that Fulbright with 5 other associations in Latin America, and I would like to mention FIESA and SIN in Argentina, Learn Chile, RCI and ASCUN in Colombia, AMPEI in Mexico, and REDI Peru. We are working together to see how we can do a lot of internationalization at home activities, how we can promote, how we can work together in promoting internationalization at home activities, and also virtual exchange. Fulbright will be leading a group in this group of associations to foster the development of internationalization at home activities. Another point that I would like to mention, and that we are creating a COIO Latin American network for universities in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia. We are working together, and we will launch this Rede Latam COIO next Tuesday. Then there are a lot of things happening regarding virtual exchange. So I believe the current situation provides challenges and also opportunities for global learning and for inclusion in this situation. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Celso. It's good to see that this now is happening in the regional level, also creating a much more regionalization policy for internationalization in Latin America, and looking at virtual mobility. I mean, if you compared it when I wrote about it 10 years ago, and advocated how the pioneers in the Sunni system were working on coil, and then it gradually started to move it very slowly, and now you see, in particular in regions like Latin America, but also Asia and Africa, there's an opportunity for different kind of way of internationalization that's quite encouraging. Irina, may I ask you to say something about this topic as well from the European perspective? If unmuted. Yeah.
Yes, well, there are definitely related developments in Europe as well. And I think if before the pandemic, only about 1 in 5 higher education institutions in Europe was referencing the internationalization of the curriculum as an area of priority in the internationalization strategies, I think were we to do this kind of survey again today, certainly the percentage will have moved higher. Of course, you know, there's still some way to go between the level of commitment and turning, you know, this commitment into reality. What I think, though, the past few months again have brought to us is new considerations. So, for example, a need to think or reimagine part of the internationalization at home activities in a reality where international students in large numbers might not be necessarily present on campus as they were in the past. In many of the internationalization at home activities, international students on campus were one of the main drivers and one of the main actors to be involved to translate these benefits of internationalization to the wider student cohort. I think there's also been an increasing realization in recent months that the internationalization of the curriculum developments need to be fully anchored in the full diversity of the student population at home. And I think with these developments that we see related to student civil unrest, related to race, these have to be more multifaceted than we used to imagine them from a purely international office perspective. So I think some of the concepts have to be further thought through and reimagined as well. And I think also we have to, in a certain extent, be optimistic, seize the momentum, but at the same time try to be realistic with what we can expect, and not jump too quickly forward, as Robin was saying as well, without these strategic considerations as well to drive the processes. So thinking of what the goals, the objectives are, and then what are the best means to achieve them.
Thank you. Chika? To be unmuted. Yeah.
Yeah, I've already spoken about how online learning has become mainstream in our institutions here, and which has also given us access to different devices and platforms to deliver education through webinars like now, and the use of Zoom and Blackboard Collaborate. And I don't see those things, ceasing to be used going forward. And those are the means through which internationalization at home can be, improved. I also believe that through the use of those platforms, we can be, those platforms provide access to international participants to be part of our programs without them leaving their shores. However, I want to highlight the deep-seated fault lines that are inherent in the use of technology in the delivery of higher education, which is the inequalities that are there in the societies, in which we live. There is unequal access to these devices, unequal access to internet, to power. Currently, we are seeing some of our students not being able to participate fully in education, despite government and our institutions providing them with laptops and data. The challenge is access to electricity. The other challenge is also access to conducive home environment to be able to continue with your studies at home. So as much as we embrace online learning, but it's not every student who's able to participate meaningfully through those means. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's important to address that issue. I mean, we have always a tendency to say that things are either or. Either we do on-site or we do online education. And even in internationalization, we have a tendency to do that. Now we should all move to COIL or virtual exchange or virtual mobility as being the opposite. And of course, as also some of the people in the chat say, not always it is possible to do everything online. There are certain disciplines where you want to have practice, and even although I think you can be much more creative technology in those areas, still physical presence at certain moments is always a benefit, and physical collaboration is a benefit. The same is, of course, the issue with Chika in particular, but also others have addressed, is the quality issue. Not always is possible to deliver a quality education because of issues that we have been discussing, students that have no access to Wi-Fi, the quality of the platforms that there are, the quality of the faculty that are resistant to change and not used to use technology. All those aspects have to be taken into consideration as when we talk about internationalization at home and collaborative online international learning, that we still have a long way to go to improve the quality and to integrate it much more in our strategy than seeing it as an alternative strategy. So thank you all for addressing those points. Unfortunately, time has already passed the closing time. We don't have time for talking more about partnerships and collaboration, although that's, of course, an other essential aspect of internationalization. And we don't have time really to go into the chat questions, although I think most of them have been addressed already in the panel discussion. So thank you for that. So let me give, first of all, thank you all five for your participation, and thank you all participants for that. And I give the floor to Hilge and Giorgio for some final concluding remarks and observations. So the floors are yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we've discussed here amongst us, and we have so little time that Giorgio was kind enough to leave the floor to me. I would like to thank every one of you, because this is a wonderful appetizer for much more conversation on the very important issues that you've been raising. What I would like to thank you for is not only for this conversation, but for having prepared it so thoroughly. And I guess I will get back to all of you with a question about how much you also have in writing, because since for once we will not be able to share presentations in the form of PowerPoints with some of the points, it would be very much appreciated, I think, by the audience and by those interested in the future of internationalization to have some of your points in writing. You don't need to take too much time to do so, but it would be wonderful. And we may even envisage to co-publish a paper with all our hands together on these very important issues, because the future of higher education beyond internationalization will depend a lot on the many issues that you've been able to raise. So a very warm thank you to Hans for an excellent moderation with key questions that we could talk to and will talk to even more in the future as well. A very warm thank you to Chika, to José Celso, to Irina, Vidya, to Robin for your excellent presentations here, and for you will count on us, I hope, for asking you back in future webinars as well, because the webinar series doesn't stop here. It started in May and it will continue at least until the end of December 2020, as this is also a longer conversation and dialogue on the many facets of the future of higher education. Next week, we will be able to talk about something very closely related to many of the topics that you've been raising here. And in particular, we will zoom in on the perspectives on reopening strategies at universities. So that's directly linked to many of the issues you raised when talking about allowing students back in, or students to go out. And if they're allowed to go out, will they be accepted in other countries? As you said, Robin, even though they are allowed to travel or would be interested, will they be able to go to other countries? Same as Vidya said, you will have these mobilities that are becoming national. I found it absolutely fascinating to hear about this new ranking that was put in place in India to allow those students who would have traveled elsewhere to feed back into the Indian system, but then where and how does that work? And that are many of the questions that you also, Irina, touched on by saying, how will Europe look at this mobility that will not take place in the fall, but where they will they go? Same with Brazil, South Africa. So these questions are not only technical on what kind of an education, what kind of a quality education do we provide, but also very much linked to even the very future of the students themselves, their plans. How did they envisage education? Where did they see themselves? How will they be able to benefit from a kind of education today and for the future that will be impacted by the current situation? And I know a lot will happen also over the summer to make the experience even better so in the fall. We hope, where we will possibly move from a crisis management of education to something that will be constructed, also learning from some of the experiences and practices that have taken place over the last few months. So in the future, as of September, we will have a series of webinars touching on the many questions that I can read in the chat indeed. And the first 3 will be devoted to technology-supported higher education, not only looking at the techniques, but certainly also at the different formats and issues that were raised on online teaching and learning, and also online collaboration, online research. And those will be carried out, most of them in September. Then in October, we will turn to higher education and research for sustainable development and establish links and discussions on how higher education is also engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 more broadly speaking. And in November, we will turn to internationalization again, look at very many different facets. Where will we be by then? If we can, even earlier than that, because much will be on the agenda on an ongoing basis. And we will as well devote a series of webinars to leadership issues, leadership challenges, leadership opportunities, the transformation of how our higher education systems in countries, on continents and internationally. So there is a lot that has been discussed here. I would like to thank you very warmly for your wonderful contributions and presentations. Thanks to all the participants for the very good questions that will lead us when we develop the next webinars. And again, maybe we will have an opportunity to say some of that in writing and share it with our participants as well. So again, wonderful. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions. And we hope to see you in person in not too far a future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you and goodbye.